Welcome to Hot Air, Cool People with Dr. Anna Gunz, a podcast devoted to cool professionals with cool ideas for a planet full of hot air. In this episode, Dr. Gunz speaks with Dr. Sean Kidd, a clinical psychologist and professor whose work focuses on climate change, mental health, and health equity.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thanks, Anna. Happy to be here.
So I guess my first question is, what was your journey to get here in your career to where you are and what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I suppose it was both a long and a short journey. Long in the sense that, since I was even in undergrad, I've worked in homeless serving sectors, shelters, drop-ins as a volunteer when I was in my early 20s through to grad school, where working with young people experiencing homelessness and houselessness became a research focus. And then on into work in severe mental illness and, developing interventions, understanding marginality, all these pieces. Well, the stage that was set for me in that regard was just spending a lot of times with folks who are really highly exposed to a range of risks, everything from more environmental kinds of risks, interpersonal risks in terms of violence exposure, a range of systematic deprivations. But that's kind of been a core building facet of my career. And it consolidated really about 6-ish years ago, where I found myself walking home from CAMH and, buying a few extra water bottles and giving them out to some folks that were camped out in very hot spaces along Queen Street, seeing warming and cooling centers, which can be helpful for a small number of people, but nonetheless strike me as really fundamentally inadequate. And just these kind of very reactive responses that we often see. And so that's where I began to just get frustrated and think, okay, there's got to be more on this. I'm a researcher, so what do? I do a scoping review, begin to look at the literature. I don't want to reinvent things. So I want to have a look and see somebody already on this, then great. But that wasn't the case. There are huge gaps and big, and also knowledge gaps that don't make sense. We have the most data from the countries and communities that need help the least. Not to say that a place like Toronto doesn't need help. We do, but compared to what's happening in some South Asian countries and African countries, really, that they have their challenges elsewhere that are profound compared even to ours. So that was my path, is just kind of being tuned in to a decent degree, I think, to folks that are experiencing various, structural disparities and mental health challenges, and then just seeing this knowledge gap related to environmental risks and then just seeing, of course, where the world is headed in terms of climate change, and frankly being just disturbed and scared about where this is going to lead, especially for people experiencing poverty. If they're, systematically left out of responses, then it could get really bad. So that's kind of where I just became very passionate. And I should say as well, it's not just it's kind of a push-pull. There's also the sense that, being involved in the National Adaptation Strategy Health Table, the many people I've met across disciplines, environmental lawyers to epidemiologists, physicians, and everything in between, a really passionate, smart, dedicated, action-oriented group of people, really focused. And so there's an energy and a creativity and just innovation to the discussions that it's so engaging. I mean, as much as this is a very grim topic and we're working in a hard space, I'm often just inspired, and I love being in conversations where I could have never predicted the direction that it went in a good way. So yes, so a few facets that have led me here and make me want to stay here.
I am really glad you said that, actually, because that's one of the things that I found, is that every time you meet someone who's working this space and is collaborative and, it is very motivating. I think there is something very isolating about being in this world a little bit, especially when you're intersection of health, because there's less people. And I think especially when you get into the clinical world as well, given that you did come from, child psychology, mental health, this homelessness lens, and hadn't had this grounding in, this big global crisis in climate change and environmental science. How did you find that in terms of gaining that knowledge, or did you go out and learn a lot, or do you collaborate with people? Was it, overwhelming? I can hear from you that it was therapeutic to enter into this world and that you are energized into it. But I'm just wondering about all the people who are interested and are worried as a person, a parent, and they don't quite know how to enter into this realm in their professional clinical research advocacy roles?
It's daunting in many ways and continuous. I would say I most definitely don't feel like I've arrived. I feel like I'm on a very steep learning curve. And it's had a number of different parts to it. Like I know I've got a wheelhouse. Like I think I know the homelessness space and the mental health care space, severe mental illness fairly well. I've been at it a long time. But there are whole areas here which are new and people have whole careers on. And sort of it's not like a primer or, refresher, a nuance to some topic I know already. So I've done a ton of reading, trying to find all the books that I can that are sort of related to, climate, health, poverty, and equity, very broad contextual stuff to whatever specific stuff I could find. I learned through lit reviews. I can't say I love reading research papers and academic papers, but doing a scoping review forces you to. And so that's where I've read a lot of papers in topics related to this. That's been helpful. We've run all these think tanks we've been running in the global health frame and homelessness, and then nationally related to poverty and health. I mean, those are great forums for a ton of learning because we find like a lot of the research, socioeconomic status or some other variables will be covariates in some big epi analysis. And you're like, okay, that makes sense, but you don't know where to go with that. But then you talk to really smart people in the space who will begin to unpack short and medium and longer term solutions and data gaps, and I'll learn a ton. So I'm constantly learning. And as well, I try to keep in my place, like in the national work that we're doing, really trying to encourage, foster, and provide support for others who are truly expert in areas to take the lead. I don't want to lead. I shouldn't lead everything. The homelessness stuff, I'll be a little more involved in leadership, but like women's health, older adults, and there are other people in other areas, Indigenous health, where they're far, far more expertise and have whole careers built on that. What we can do, I see there the job I can do fairly well is bring people together who haven't collaborated before, as well as in things like scoping reviews and that. We have some funding, which they're very fortunate. We can be the ditch diggers in a way, is where other folks can guide the stuff around questions and parameters and interpreting findings, but we've got some staff who can do the lit search and find the papers and clean them up and that sort of stuff. So yes, I think it's one part continuous learning, and I certainly have knowledge gaps. I'd be lying if I sometimes am not in calls with environmental health experts and I come up like, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not even sure what that particular thing is, or I'll say something that's kind of ignorant. They'll sound that way at times. Because it's people who are deeply grounded in these knowledge bases and professions who, at times I certainly am a novice, but I just try and, be transparent about that. I know some stuff, but I think it's ultimately, and I don't sweat it too much. It's just sort of like, I think this is a very complex set of knowledges that need to come together. I've got some, and we've got comes back to that partnership idea. If you wait for me to become expert in all this kind of stuff, it's just never going to happen. Like, we need to be with people with expertise in many areas.
You recently did a scoping review on environmental impacts on mental health in youth. Can you tell us about some of the big findings from that, or ways to conceptualize that you were able to bring out?
Yeah, for sure. So that was another one. Like, it's the idea that, of course, we've always had this strange juxtaposition between mental health and brain health, right? And in terms of public discourse, mental health is by far more discussed. And of course, there's a huge amount of writing and thinking about, things like anxiety and climate change and depression and climate change. And fair, absolutely, it needs to be looked at. But I'm also aware of just, the brain health implications. And by that, I mean, and there's an overlap, and it's not even clear how these things are different things, but like kind of the neurobiology and brain development sort of aspects, which tend to be tied more in with brain health versus sort of expressions of those things, like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, what you have, whatever it is, which tends to be referred to as mental health or mental illness. But that's where the interest came from, is again, kind of seeing a gap, but not a gap per se. I mean, there's loads and loads of research on air pollution, for example, and brain development. But the gap that I was perceiving is in an integrated way, thinking about the implications of climate change, whether it's air pollution, heat, malnutrition, vector-borne illness, water security across the board. But like, as writ large, what are the implications of climate change for brain development and brain health? And we're starting to see, some of like the World Health Organization, other groups sort of saying, hey, this is a really serious problem in question. So what I did was that's the review we did had a strength and a limitation, both I think significant. The significant limitation is that we only looked at papers that mention or tied in with climate change directly. And of course, there are loads of papers that talk about heat and heat waves and maybe don't even mention climate change. But what that did is, because we're humans and not AI, that made it manageable. We didn't have the bandwidth to review 18,000 papers, but it made it manageable, but it allowed us to have a scan. And I'd say, ultimately, it was a kind of it's a frightening prospect, really, the brain development pieces. I didn't know a lot of it. Like, these are literatures I definitely wasn't on top of. But if you take it as a gestalt, just seeing, for heat waves and preterm birth risk and implications for, fetal health and infant health and brain development and how that plays out in the lifelong trajectories of infants, children, and youth and into adulthood at a population level, malnutrition, air pollution. If we kind of consider all of these things, we've got a really kind of scary intersection with huge implications for developing brains and healthy brains. And kind of working backwards from that is an awful lot of who we are, what we can do and accomplish as groups and as individuals, anchors to having a healthy brain and having healthy brains coming together. So that was really illuminating. And then as well, too, I feel like there are certain of the various people who work in healthcare or in science behind healthcare, there can be groups that might not feel as connected with this topic. Like, there might be some, biologically oriented psychiatrists, clinician scientists who might, hear about climate anxiety and be concerned, but not really see themselves and their epigenetics work or their brain science work as relevant to this. But I've had some discussions recently in talking about, things like, the maternal health preterm birth piece, the air pollution piece, or talking about, in terms of the brain as like medication malfunctions when people are dehydrated and the death rates of people with severe mental health challenges. You suddenly have a spark of interest, like, wow, I didn't really know about that. And that actually does tie into what I do. So I think an asset from that review was to enable, I think we've got to make this tent a really big one and bring a lot of people in. And this isn't all about climate anxiety. And that's where we need to have colleagues who are working in brain science and brain health and other areas too. And so that's where I think that review is helpful for me. And like I mentioned at the very beginning, is I learned by doing reviews, and that's an area I was weak on. So I did a review and I feel better informed.
I am really glad that you did, because this is often what I talk about as well. When people are talking about mental health, and I agree, there's this maybe disconnection, or if you're a different clinician, it might be, well, I can't really, okay, you're getting PTSD after a major event. It's almost intuitive and people's experience. But there are absolutely interactions that are happening and affecting our neurobiology that are manifesting in, air pollution, early onset schizophrenia in children, the articles with air quality and depression, air quality, conduct disorder, and, childhood behavior, neurodevelopment, dementia in adults, and, as well as, air quality in childhood brain tumors and astrocytomas that we've seen in Ontario, as well as now associated with proximity to wildfire smoke. And I think it allows people to access the information in a different way. And I think of eco-distress as a chronic coping stress that everyone has around serving this, but leaning into this. And I feel like there's not enough dialogue as well. I think in the healthcare system and planetary health, a lot of people really focus on an intersection of social justice level or mitigation. And that's huge. It's huge in the healthcare system, but not enough. When we're actually talking about adaptation, we have to understand the health effects so that we can talk about, like it's hot out. You could end up getting aggression. So you have this senior who's in a senior's home in heat, who's now getting more aggressive behavior. So they're given an antipsychotic, which then impairs their heat responses. And, and so this medication piece that I think from a physician nursing perspective, hot day plans involve thinking about adjusting all of these different cardiac meds, these psychiatric meds, thinking about the behavior of people coming in, and then also surge planning. Like if you're in a psychiatric, milieu, or you're in an emergency department, what are you going to see in terms of like strokes, MIs, dehydration and electrolyte disorders, especially with these people with these inherent reflexes, and people with mental health, pre-existing mental health exacerbations, and then tying it into some of this neurobiology, I think is essential, and not not talked enough about. And quite frankly, the literature in children and youth and how it affects their neurodevelopment and is linked to these psychiatric illnesses, it's frightening. And we have to make sure that we take that fright and fear into action. But I just wish we talked more about it. And I do wonder if this could be a key to have people lean in and go, okay, what can I do beyond just our own individual action? And yes, as clinicians, as people, there is an individual responsibility, but a lot of that also comes to motivating, the representatives who make the decision, like our municipal, provincial, federal representatives, actually just writing them an email and participating at a level that can influence decision making. And some of that, I do think it's just conversation with each other to make sure, other people are working in this area and our own individual action. But I think that comment is leading into a question, given where you are as given your expertise as a psychologist, as a human and a father. Like, where do you balance this piece between having people lean in and then eco-distress? And I find that pairs exactly into this question of individual action versus systemic change. And how do you motivate people? And we have to do the right thing, but without them crossing and falling on the other side, with this trying to live perfectly in this mobilized life. And as a pediatrician too, adolescents and young people, I think, are especially prone to this gung-ho, perfect, and then this kind of disillusionment and falling off the cliff.
Yeah. And what you mentioned there is some recent discussions about the concept of institutional betrayal, which really resonates. I think, to my mind, a couple of parts to that question that at least for me makes sense is there needs to be a dynamic or a bit of an interaction between two elements. One is informing, and informing will mean people being distressed. Like I found personally the brain development aspects really disturbing, really reading and learning about all of the different ways that's happening. But tying in with that learning and keeping it apace with avenues for action and having them match each other somehow, so that one's knowledge generation and fear and just being disturbed and disillusioned, all those pieces is kind of tied in proportionally to avenues for action. And then pacing. I mean, I think there needs to be a bit of a dynamic of engaging, acting, doing that stuff, but then also taking a step back and collecting oneself again. And even the collecting oneself again and taking a step back can be tied into what the effort is here. Certainly hear from many folks, particularly our Indigenous colleagues and collaborators, about the importance of getting back to the land and spending some time in nature. And it's not just kind of rejuvenating, I think, in a general sort of way, but it can also help a person sort of feel grounded with the fundamental cause in all of this and take a break and, tied in with that, but then coming back to the work that needs to be done. So, I mean, that's my probably imperfect answer. But I really think if anyone, in my opinion, if anyone's looking for a really kind of a positive or good space to land here, I'm not sure if it's there. I think it's going to be hard, and it is hard. And it's sort of how can we just, as in other disaster and crisis scenarios, how can we have this as a hard situation, which it is, but also have people, forming good community around each other, acting together, being frustrated together, crying together, and grieving, and these elements. But I think that element of community as well is just finding a path. And I think there's many precedents to learn from. It doesn't need to be related to climate. Even there's many crisis scenarios where we could take a note from, where people face some really hard things, but came up with some solutions that came out the other side intact.
Thanks. I know you have to go. I just want to ask before you go, would you be able to explain in briefly what your collaborative is and your main objectives?
Yeah, so our collaborative is a group of mostly researchers, but it's certainly a mixed bag. There's some policy folks and others involved. The collaboration of about 40 or so folks, individuals. These are experts across disciplines, geographies, populations of focus, Indigenous representation, folks working in environmental racism. We've got organizations, some national collaborating centers, CAPE, others, all coming together on the topic through think tanks, reviews, participatory action projects, the topic of poverty, health, and climate, and where those things intersect. Many will say, wow, that is an incredibly diffuse and broad topic. And I completely agree. But where I think we agree as a group is that there's a lot of very broad understanding about climate change as a threat multiplier. But behind that, getting into the details about where the issues are and how they manifest and how we need to respond, there are huge gaps of knowledge and gaps of collaboration. So our two goals, one is to gather information, provide it to funders and various actors so they can make more informed decisions about what they're doing. And the second goal is a process goal, is if we achieve nothing else through this other than a group of folks in the space know each other better, are collaborating on projects and grants, I will walk away very happy. So I think those are our two objectives.
Perfect. And you've said to me as well, just emphasizing looking at specific on the ground action or intervention. Final question I ask everyone, and I have a sense from a previous answer, is what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? I think it's a few parts to that. One part is the brilliant, amazing humans. I know humans we're so often framed as the terrible and bad actors in this climate crisis we're in, and we sure have done a lot of that. But I also gain hope from just the amazing, brilliant, energized, creative people, and not just the established academics and stuff now, but just the up and coming folks, the energy that's brought to this. And I think we can do some amazing things, and I think some of those things will defy some of the more dire predictions of our situation. I also think our environment and nature, whatever the frame is really tough. I think it will be hard on us, but I'm also confident that there are systems there that can bounce back. Might take a long time, and there might be some suffering, but I think if you look at our environment and nature, I think things can turn around.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today. It was a pleasure, and I learned a lot. Nice to see you.
Thanks for listening to Hot Air, Cool People with Dr. Anna Gunz. Special thanks to our guest, Dr. Sean Kidd, and the Climate Change, Environment, and Health Production team. This episode was produced by Jakob Wilk, Amaan Thawer, and Mariah Peters, and managed by Danielle Pineda and Olivia D'Andrea Brooks. Show artwork was created by Laney Beaulieu. Details and links are in the episode notes. Until next time.